To understand what happened in March 1986, you need to understand the ocean. For most of human history, the sea was a place of mystery. Once you descended below the surface, you vanished. Submarines, invented in the early 20th century, exploited this invisibility. By World War II, they'd become the ultimate stealth weapon. Silent hunters that could appear anywhere, strike without warning, and disappear into the depths. But sound changes everything. Water is an excellent conductor of acoustic energy. A whale song can travel thousands of kilometers through the ocean. A submarine, no matter how quiet, creates sound. Propellers cavitate, pumps hum, metal hulls creak under pressure. And if you're listening carefully enough, with the right equipment, you can hear it all. During the Cold War, this became the central paradox of submarine warfare. How do you hide in a medium that transmits sound so efficiently? The Soviet Union built submarines and sent them prowling near American coastlines, threatening nuclear retaliation if war broke out. The United States needed to track them. Every single one of them. All the time. In the 1950s, the US Navy began developing SOSUS, the Sound Surveillance System. Chains of underwater hydrophones bolted to the ocean floor, listening. By the 1960s, these arrays stretched across the Atlantic and Pacific, creating invisible tripwires that Soviet submarines couldn't cross undetected. But SOSUS had limitations. It was fixed, expensive, vulnerable to detection and sabotage. And it couldn't cover everywhere. So in the 1970s, the Navy developed something new. Mobile sonobuoy networks that could be deployed anywhere, anytime, creating temporary surveillance grids in hours instead of years. These weren't the simple sonobuoys of World War II, dumb listening devices that radioed back what they heard. These were smart, networked. They could process signals, filter out background noise, triangulate contacts, and communicate with each other to build a complete acoustic picture of everything happening beneath the waves. By the mid-1980s, this technology had matured into something extraordinary, and it was classified at the highest levels, even from allies, especially from allies. Because in intelligence work, there's a fundamental rule. Sources and methods are more valuable than the intelligence they produce. You never, ever reveal how you know what you know. March 11th, 1986. 3 days before Commander Yamada's discovery, the submarine Yushio departed Kure Naval Base in Hiroshima Prefecture at 0600 hours. It was one of Japan's most modern diesel-electric submarines, part of a new generation designed to patrol the waters around the Japanese archipelago and monitor Soviet Pacific Fleet movements. The mission was routine, a 5-day surveillance exercise in the Philippine Sea, practicing detection and tracking procedures. Japan's Maritime Self-Defense Force had been expanding its capabilities throughout the 1980s, taking on more responsibility for regional security as part of its alliance with the United States. Yamada, 41 years old, had commanded Yushio for 18 months. He was a professional, methodical, respected by his crew. He joined the JMSDF in 1967, trained with American and British submariners, and risen through the ranks on merit and patience. His father had served in the Imperial Japanese Navy during World War II on a submarine that never returned from patrol in 1944. Yamada never talked about it, but everyone knew. He understood what silence meant in these waters. On March 13th, the mission parameters changed. Tokyo headquarters transmitted new orders. proceed to a designated area east of Okinawa and conduct acoustic surveillance. Intelligence suggested increased Soviet submarine activity in the region. Yamada was to position Yushio along a known Soviet transit route and gather signal intelligence. By midnight on March 14th, they were on station. That's when Matsumoto detected the first sonar buoy. At first, Yamada thought it might be Japanese. Perhaps another JMSDF unit was operating nearby and hadn't been informed. But the acoustic signature was wrong. The transmission frequencies were different, and when Matsumoto analyzed the signal processing patterns, there was no doubt. American. Definitely American. Could they be conducting exercises? The executive officer asked. Yamada considered it. The US 7th Fleet regularly operated in these waters. Joint exercises happened frequently. But something felt wrong. Why hadn't they been notified? Standard procedure required coordination notices for any operations in this area. Matsumoto, go active sonar. 1 ping, low power. Let's see what we're really dealing with. The sonar operator hesitated. Going active meant revealing their position. But orders were orders. 1 pulse of sound radiated outward through the water. The return echoes painted a picture that made everyone in the control room freeze. Sonar buoys, dozens of them, arranged in a precise geometric pattern, each separated by exactly 15 kilometers. The grid extended in every direction, as far as their sonar could reach. And at this depth, with these conditions, that meant the array might stretch across hundreds of kilometers of ocean. Yamada's hands began to shake. He clasped them behind his back so his crew wouldn't see. This wasn't an exercise. This was infrastructure. For the next 6 hours, Yamada kept Yushio at depth, silent, observing. Matsumoto documented everything. The sonar buoys transmitted in bursts, millisecond-long packets of encrypted data. They weren't broadcasting continuously, like old-style buoys. Instead, they listened passively, processed what they heard locally, and only transmitted when they detected something significant. And they were detecting Yushio. Sir, Matsumoto said quietly. The transmission patterns are changing. When we moved 3 kilometers north, the buoys nearest to us increased their broadcast frequency. They're tracking us. The executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Hayashi, leaned over the navigation table. How is that possible? We're barely making 8 knots. Our acoustic signature should be minimal. It doesn't matter how quiet we are, Yamada said slowly, the realization forming as he spoke. The system isn't trying to hear us over background noise. It's listening to the background noise itself. Ocean ambient sound has patterns. Biological, geological, weather-driven. We're a disruption in those patterns. A hole in the sound where we should hear waves or marine life or thermal currents, but instead there's nothing. Hayashi stared at him. That would require computational power beyond anything we have. Yes, it would. Yamada met his eyes. Which means the Americans have it. Yamada made a decision. He ordered Yushio to surface, to periscope depth, and transmitted an encrypted message to Fleet Headquarters. Discovered extensive US sonar buoy network. Request guidance. The response came back 90 minutes later. Continue surveillance. Document all contacts. Do not engage. Additional orders follow. For the rest of that day and through the night, Yushio crept through the grid, mapping its extent. They discovered the network wasn't random. It was layered. Shallow water buoys at 100 meters depth, monitoring surface vessels and snorkeling submarines. Deep water buoys at 400 meters, listening to the sound channel where acoustic energy travels farthest, and in some locations what appeared to be seafloor mounted nodes, permanent installations feeding data to the mobile network. It was vast, sophisticated, expensive, and it had been there, watching, for God knows how long. On March 16th, Yamada received new orders. Return to base immediately. Upon arrival, report directly to Vice Admiral Kobayashi, commander of the submarine flotilla. The crew was ordered to discuss the mission with no one. As Yushio turned toward home, Yamada stood in the control room, watching the sonar display. The Sonar Buoys tracked them all the way to the edge of Japanese territorial waters. Then, as if granting permission, they went silent. March 19th, 1986. JMSDF headquarters, Yokosuka. Commander Yamada sat in a windowless conference room on the third floor of the administration building. Vice Admiral Kobayashi sat across from him, along with 2 intelligence officers and a liaison from the American 7th Fleet. Commander Richard Stokes, a soft-spoken Texan who'd been coordinating US-Japanese submarine operations for 3 years. Yamada had prepared a detailed report, charts, acoustic recordings, analysis. He'd expected questions, perhaps concern about operational security or coordination failures. He hadn't expected what happened next. Commander Yamada, Admiral Kobayashi began, did you photograph or record the actual Sonar Buoys? Physical images? No, sir. We maintained distance and conducted passive observation only as ordered. Good. Kobayashi glanced at the American liaison. Commander Stokes has some information to share. Stokes leaned forward. His expression was friendly, but his eyes were careful. Commander, first let me say, your discovery doesn't surprise us. You're a skilled operator, and Yushio is an excellent platform. What you encountered is part of a larger surveillance system that has been operational in the Pacific for several years. Several years? Yamada kept his voice level. Sir, with respect, why weren't we informed? Japan and the United States coordinate closely on naval operations. This kind of capability is classified special access program, Stokes interrupted gently. Above top secret, compartmented. Even within the US Navy, fewer than 100 officers have complete knowledge of the system's capabilities and deployment. March 19th, 1986. JMSDF headquarters, Yokosuka. Commander Yamada sat in a windowless conference room on the third floor of the administration building. Vice Admiral Kobayashi sat across from him, along with 2 intelligence officers and a liaison from the American 7th Fleet. Commander Richard Stokes, a soft-spoken Texan who'd been coordinating US-Japanese submarine operations for 3 years. Yamada had prepared a detailed report, charts, acoustic recordings, analysis. He'd expected questions, perhaps concern about operational security or coordination failures. He hadn't expected what happened next. Commander Yamada, Admiral Kobayashi began, did you photograph or record the actual Sonar Buoys? Physical images? No, sir. We maintained distance and conducted passive observation only as ordered. Good. Kobayashi glanced at the American liaison. Commander Stokes has some information to share. Stokes leaned forward. His expression was friendly, but his eyes were careful. Commander, first let me say, your discovery doesn't surprise us. You're a skilled operator, and Yushio is an excellent platform. What you encountered is part of a larger surveillance system that has been operational in the Pacific for several years. Several years? Yamada kept his voice level. Sir, with respect, why weren't we informed? Japan and the United States coordinate closely on naval operations. This kind of capability is classified special access program, Stokes interrupted gently. Above top secret, compartmented. Even within the US Navy, fewer than 100 officers have complete knowledge of the system's capabilities and deployment. One of the Japanese intelligence officers spoke up. But Commander, surely strategic allies should be informed of capabilities that directly affect our operations. Stokes chose his words carefully. The decision to limit information sharing was made at the highest levels of both governments. The surveillance network's effectiveness depends on adversaries, primarily the Soviet Union, not understanding its true capabilities. If we brief Allied forces broadly, the risk of compromise increases exponentially. Translation, Yamada thought. They don't trust us. They don't trust anyone. How long has this been operational in Japanese waters? Yamada asked. A pause. I'm not authorized to discuss specific timelines or deployment areas. Commander Stokes, Admiral Kobayashi said, his voice hardening, we're not asking for technical specifications. But Commander Yamada's discovery raises serious questions. Are Japanese submarines routinely tracked by American systems without our knowledge? When we conduct operations, even in our own territorial waters, are we being monitored by our own allies? Stokes met the Admiral's gaze. Sir, the United States deeply values its partnership with Japan. The surveillance network exists to protect both our nations from Soviet aggression. It tracks all submarine contacts, yes, including friendly forces. This allows us to maintain a complete picture of subsurface activity and respond to threats rapidly. In other words, Yamada said quietly, the ocean is no longer neutral territory. It's American territory. We just operate in it, with your permission. The room went silent. What Commander Yamada had discovered was just the visible edge of something much larger. The surveillance network he'd encountered was part of an initiative called Project Blackfish, a classified program that had been operational since 1982. Its goal was simple but staggering. Create a mobile, rapidly deployable acoustic monitoring system that could track every submarine in the Pacific Ocean simultaneously. Traditional SOSUS arrays were powerful but limited. They were fixed installations, which meant submarines could potentially map them and find gaps. They required underwater cables and shore stations, making them vulnerable to sabotage. And they couldn't be moved. If the Soviets shifted their patrol routes, SOSUS couldn't follow. Blackfish solved these problems. The Sonar Buoys weren't really buoys in the traditional sense. They were autonomous underwater listening stations with their own power supplies, acoustic processors, and communication systems. They could be deployed by aircraft, surface ships, or even submarines. And once in the water, they sank to program depths and began listening. But the real innovation was networking. Each buoy didn't just record sound and transmit it back to base. Instead, the buoys communicated with each other using low-frequency acoustic signals that traveled through the water. They formed a mesh network, sharing data and processing power. When one buoy detected something interesting, it could task nearby buoys to focus their sensors on that area, creating zones of concentrated surveillance on the fly. The system used advanced signal processing algorithms that could identify submarine signatures from hundreds of kilometers away. It could track multiple contacts simultaneously, predict their courses, and even classify them. Soviet Akula class, American Los Angeles class, British Trafalgar class. Each submarine had a unique acoustic fingerprint based on propeller design, machinery configuration, and hull resonance. And because the buoys were mobile and could be deployed covertly, adversaries couldn't map the network. Today's surveillance grid might be in the South China Sea. Tomorrow it could be off the Kamchatka Peninsula. The ocean had become transparent, at least to those who controlled the network. The United States had spent billions developing this technology, and they'd shared it with almost no one, not even the British, their closest intelligence partners. Certainly not Japan. In the weeks following his return, Commander Yamada found himself caught in a strange limbo. Officially, nothing had changed. He continued commanding Ushio, conducting patrols, training his crew, but something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of his role. Every time they went to sea, Yamada wondered, are we being watched? When headquarters orders us to conduct surveillance in a certain area, is it because they have intelligence suggesting Soviet activity? Or because the Americans told them where to look? Are we independent operators, or are we playing roles in someone else's strategy? He couldn't discuss it with his crew. He couldn't discuss it with other commanders. The mission had been classified, and everyone aboard Ushio had been reminded of the consequences of unauthorized disclosure. But Yamada had friends in the submarine force, officers he'd trained with, served with, trusted. And in careful, oblique conversations over drinks or in quiet moments, he began to understand that he wasn't the only one who'd noticed strange things. Captain Ito, commanding the submarine Mochishio, mentioned that during a recent exercise, his sonar operator had detected what appeared to be a sophisticated acoustic beacon network in an area where no Japanese or American forces were supposed to be operating. Commander Sato, newly assigned to a diesel-electric submarine, reported that American liaison officers had seemed unusually interested in his boat's acoustic signature data, not for intelligence purposes, but as if they were calibrating something. Lieutenant Commander Fukuda, a communications specialist, mentioned that certain encrypted American military channels broadcast continuously in the Pacific, transmitting what appeared to be automated data packets. When Japanese signals intelligence tried to analyze them, the Americans politely but firmly requested they stop. The pattern was clear. The surveillance network Yamada had discovered wasn't isolated to one area. It was everywhere. An invisible infrastructure that the Americans had woven through the Pacific without telling anyone, not even their closest allies. And Japan, proud, modern, technologically advanced Japan, was completely dependent on American intelligence, derived from systems they didn't control, couldn't access, and barely understood. May 1986, 2 months after the initial discovery, Yamada was summoned to another meeting in Tokyo. This time, the room included senior officials from the Defense Ministry, the Foreign Ministry, and the Cabinet Intelligence and Research Office. The question on the table: what should Japan do? The debate that followed would define Japan's maritime strategy for decades. Some officials argued for confrontation. Japan was a sovereign nation, they said. The presence of an extensive American surveillance network in Japanese waters, possibly even within territorial seas, was a violation of sovereignty. The Americans should be required to disclose the system's full capabilities and provide Japan with access or control. Others argued for accommodation. The US-Japan alliance was the cornerstone of Japanese security. Picking a fight over intelligence methods would damage the relationship precisely when Soviet military power was at its peak. Better to accept the situation and work within it. Still others saw opportunity. If the Americans had developed such advanced acoustic surveillance technology, perhaps Japan could acquire it, or develop its own version. The nation had world-class electronics companies, brilliant engineers, and substantial defense budgets. Why not build an independent capability? Vice Admiral Kobayashi, who'd been quietly listening, finally spoke. Gentlemen, we're asking the wrong question. The issue isn't whether we like the Americans having this system. The issue is what it means for the future of submarine warfare. The room fell silent. Commander Yamada's discovery proves that stealth submarines, the foundation of modern naval deterrence, may no longer be stealthy. If the Americans can track submarines with this precision, how long before the Soviets develop similar capabilities? How long before the Chinese do? What happens to our submarine force when the ocean becomes transparent? It was a profound question. Japan's submarine fleet was designed for defense, for tracking Soviet submarines approaching Japanese waters, for protecting sea lanes and deterring aggression. But if submarines could be tracked continuously, if their positions were known to adversaries at all times, what was their purpose? A senior foreign ministry official leaned forward. Admiral, are you suggesting that our entire submarine strategy is obsolete? I'm suggesting it might become obsolete, and we need to prepare for that future. The meeting ended without resolution. But a decision was made. Japan would not confront the United States about the surveillance network. Instead, they would quietly begin developing their own advanced acoustic monitoring capabilities, leveraging their expertise in electronics and signal processing. And they would never again assume they operated unseen. While Japanese officials debated their response, another player was watching. The Soviet Union had long suspected that American acoustic surveillance capabilities exceeded public knowledge. Soviet submariners reported strange incidents, missions that seemed compromised before they began, American forces appearing with uncanny timing, patrol routes that seemed predicted rather than detected. In June 1986, a Soviet Akula-class submarine operating in the Sea of Okhotsk detected a similar Sonar buoy network. The commander, Captain Dmitry Volkov, was more aggressive than Yamada. He ordered his submarine to approach one of the buoys directly, attempting to recover it for analysis. The moment his submarine closed, within 1 kilometer, every buoy in the network began transmitting simultaneously. Not data packets, but loud, continuous acoustic signals across multiple frequencies. It was deafening, overwhelming Volkov's sonar completely. And it was a message. We see you. We've always seen you. Don't touch our equipment. Volkov broke off and retreated to deep water. But the damage was done. The incident was reported up the Soviet chain of command, reaching the naval staff in Moscow. The Soviets began their own crash program to develop networked acoustic surveillance. They poured resources into it, recognizing that whoever controlled ocean transparency would control submarine warfare. But they were behind, years behind, and the technological gap was widening. This created a dangerous dynamic. The more sophisticated American surveillance became, the more vulnerable Soviet submarines felt. And vulnerable submarines, especially ones carrying nuclear missiles, were submarines whose commanders might act preemptively in a crisis. The Cold War's nuclear balance had always depended on mutual uncertainty. Both sides maintained submarine-launched ballistic missiles as a secure second strike capability. Even if your homeland was destroyed in a surprise attack, submarines at sea would survive and retaliate, ensuring mutual destruction and therefore deterring war. But what if submarines weren't secure? What if they could be tracked and destroyed before they launched their missiles? The paradox was cruel. Better surveillance technology made the world safer from accidental war by reducing uncertainty. But it also made deliberate war more thinkable by threatening the survivability of sea-based nuclear deterrence. American strategists understood this, which is why Project Blackfish was so highly classified. The existence of comprehensive ocean surveillance had to be deniable, ambiguous, just uncertain enough that Soviet planners couldn't be sure whether their submarines were truly vulnerable. Commander Yamada, in his small way, had stumbled into the heart of this strategic dilemma. Through 1986 and 1987, Japan's maritime self-defense force quietly adapted. New training protocols emphasized assuming continuous surveillance. Submarine commanders were taught to operate as if all their movements were observed and to focus on capabilities that remained valuable even without stealth. Endurance, weapon systems, tactical unpredictability. Japan invested heavily in quieting technology and making their submarines as acoustically silent as possible. But they also developed new operational concepts, rapid reaction tactics that emphasized speed over stealth, saturation approaches that assumed enemies would detect them but couldn't stop them, and coordination with surface and air forces to create dilemmas that surveillance alone couldn't solve. And they began developing their own acoustic monitoring systems. Japanese companies like Mitsubishi and NEC had world-class expertise in signal processing and underwater acoustics. Within 5 years, Japan had deployed its first generation of networked sonar buoys, less sophisticated than the American version but functional. By the early 1990s, when the Cold War ended and the Soviet threat diminished, Japan had transformed its maritime defense posture. They were no longer simply operating submarines. They were building a comprehensive underwater surveillance architecture, protecting their sea lanes not through secrecy, but through awareness. The irony was profound. The American system that had shocked Commander Yamada became the template for Japan's own capabilities. The student had learned from the master. And as other nations, China, India, Australia, began developing their own acoustic monitoring networks, the ocean became a battle space defined not by hiding, but by knowing. Commander Takeshi Yamada retired from the Maritime Self-Defense Force in 1993 after a distinguished 26-year career. He'd risen to captain, commanded 3 different submarines, and served as a staff officer in submarine operations planning. He'd trained a generation of younger officers and been decorated for his contributions to Japan's maritime defense. But he never forgot that night in March 1986, when he realized the ocean had changed forever. In a rare interview years later, speaking carefully to avoid disclosing classified information, Yamada reflected on what he'd learned. We think of the ocean as vast, as unknowable, and for most of human history, it was. But technology has a way of conquering mysteries. What I discovered that night wasn't just a surveillance system, it was the future. A future where nothing stays hidden, where every movement leaves a trace, where the game isn't about disappearing. It's about managing what others know about you. He paused, choosing his words carefully. People ask me if I felt betrayed when I realized the Americans had been watching us without telling us. But betrayal is the wrong word. In intelligence work, in military affairs, trust is always conditional. Allies cooperate, but they also compete. They share some things and withhold others. The Americans did what any major power would do. They developed a technological advantage and they protected it. But it taught me something important. In the modern world, sovereignty isn't just about territory or laws. It's about capability. It's about having the technology to see what others see, to know what others know. Japan learned that lesson, and we adapted. Today, in 2025, the ocean is more transparent than ever. Multiple nations operate sophisticated acoustic monitoring networks, satellite surveillance, autonomous underwater vehicles, artificial intelligence-driven signal processing. The technologies Commander Yamada encountered in their infancy have matured into comprehensive ocean awareness systems. Modern submarines are quieter than ever, but the sensors listening for them are more sensitive. It's an endless technological race, and the advantage keeps shifting. The strategic implications continue to evolve. Nuclear deterrence now depends not just on submarine survivability, but on the uncertainty about submarine detectability. Nations invest billions in both stealth technology and surveillance capabilities, each trying to stay ahead of the other. And the question Yamada confronted in 1986 remains relevant. What does security mean when nothing can stay hidden? How do nations cooperate when the foundation of cooperation is asymmetric information? There's a deeper irony in this story. The surveillance network that shocked Japanese submariners was built by their closest ally, ostensibly to protect them from Soviet submarines. But the act of building it, of not sharing it, revealed the limits of alliance. The Americans trusted Japan enough to defend them, but not enough to give them equal access to the systems doing the defending. That's the uncomfortable truth about modern security. Even allies have secrets. Even partners compete. And the ocean, like cyberspace, like space itself, has become a domain where technological advantage determines sovereignty, more than any treaty or agreement. Commander Yamada discovered this by accident on one routine patrol mission. But what he learned changed how an entire nation thought about maritime security. The ocean may look the same on the surface, but underneath it's no longer a place of mystery. It's a place of constant observation. And it belongs to whoever can see it best.